Chapter 2. Los Angeles, the Present. Jordan! Teresa opened the door wider and offered a hug. She'd gotten used to the feel of the shoulder holster on her brother-in-law's visits. Well, this is a surprise. Uncle Geordie! Danny cried, and ran down the hall with more excitement than he usually allowed himself to show these days. Having an uncle in the FBI still held some allure for the 12-year-old. Good to see you, buddy. Jordan leaned down to hug the boy. Finding he didn't have to lean very far, he asked, You have a growth spurt? Did he? Teresa closed the front door. Outgrew a brand new $70 pair of Nikes in 3 weeks. Sorry, Mom, Danny said with an impish grin. You keep this up, you'll never be a fighter pilot, Jordan said. Danny's most recent ambition. Yeah, but I might make the NBA, his nephew countered. Jordan pursed his lips. More money, he said judiciously. More glory and fame, Danny pointed out. More injuries, too. Yeah, but they probably won't be fatal. Well, I can't argue with that, Jordan said with a smile. And on that note, I'd like to change the subject. Can you stay for dinner? Teresa asked. Well, he looked a bit shy. I was wondering if I could stay a few days, actually. I've got a job in the area and you folks are about equidistant from all the places I'll need to go. Yes! Danny cried, punching his arm into the air. How long can you stay, Uncle Geordie? Only for about a week. Jordan looked apologetically at Teresa. And well he might, she thought. Teresa loved her brother-in-law, but he should know better than to show up like this without calling. What if they'd had plans? She took a deep breath. Well, then he'd go to a hotel, and they never had plans. At least no plans that couldn't include him. Still, it wasn't right. What if she had a boyfriend? Miles and Jordan were living alone together in the family homestead when they met Teresa. Money hadn't been a problem. Their parents, killed in a car accident along with their little sister, had been heavily insured. Miles had been pursuing his master's in math, while she'd taken courses in accounting with CPA as her goal. They'd hit it off right away. In 3 weeks they were engaged, and they'd married over the semester break. Jordan had been 16 when she'd married Miles. He'd been a peach from the time he was introduced to her, more like a brother than a brother-in-law. The day she'd moved in, Jordan had insisted, near purple with embarrassment, on turning the finished den in the basement into his new bedroom. It had taken him 2 weeks after that to be able to actually look at Teresa when he talked to her. But Jordan was a manager. He'd managed things then, he managed things now. She'd first realized it when she discovered that by sacrificing his bedroom, he'd acquired unheard-of privacy for a 16-year-old. A private entrance to his basement domain with the upstairs door locked. He's fine, Miles had told her. Just leave him alone. He won't do anything foolish. Teresa had thought that wildly optimistic advice given Jordan's age, but he had never given them reason to worry. After Miles's death, Jordan had taken a leave of absence from the FBI and moved in with them. Though it had never been mentioned, this had its practical aspect. It allowed the Bureau to pursue its unavoidable investigation of the brothers without embarrassing anybody. And shattered as she was, Teresa had really needed him. He'd done everything, taken care of all the arrangements. Shopped, cooked, kept them all going. Once he was cleared, and even before that, Teresa suspected, he devoted countless hours to the hunt for the Connors, and as far as she knew, he continued to do so. Danny thought the world of him, and Jordan was always there for the kids. Teresa knew that he and Danny sometimes talked for an hour at a time on the phone and on Jordan's nickel. It made her feel guilty that she resented his just showing up like this. Jordan looked around. "Where's Blythe?" he asked. "Away at school," Teresa said. "She got that scholarship, remember?" "Oh, yeah," he managed to say before Danny began to drag him away. Watching her son and her brother-in-law moving towards the kitchen, laughing and high-fiving, she thought it was a miracle that Danny had never told his uncle the truth. "Danny!" she called out. "Set another place." "Mom! Don't call me that," he said with a frown. "I'm not a little kid anymore." "Sorry," she said to her son. "Oh, yes," Teresa answered Jordan's raised eyebrow. "It's Dan or Daniel now." "Then maybe you should call me Jordan," he said to Dan. Daniel looked at his uncle for a moment, then nodded slowly. Teresa's lips tightened. His father had done just the same thing when he was thinking something through. Jordan nodded too. She stifled a sigh. The men in her family were all so much alike. Dan said goodnight reluctantly and dragged himself upstairs as though there were weights on his feet. Jordan grinned at Teresa as she handed him a glass of wine, patting his stomach comfortably. "Now that was what I call a steak. Not surprised Dan isn't fading away, but he's grown so much. I hardly recognized him. Since he's like a miniature Miles, I find that hard to believe." Teresa settled herself on the couch. "So, what brings you to town?" "He is like his dad, isn't he?" She nodded, holding his eyes and waiting patiently. He waved his hand at her look as if to wipe it away. "You know I can't talk about business with you, Teresa." "Well, okay. Can you at least tell me where you're working?" He heaved an exaggerated sigh. "Escondido." Teresa's eyes widened. "That's over 100 miles from here." She cocked her head. "From what you said, though, I gather you're working somewhere else, too. Somewhere that puts us in the middle. So where else?" "San Marcos," he mumbled around a sip of wine. "San Marcos?" Her eyes danced. "Isn't that right next door to Escondido?" He cocked an eye at her. "So sue me. I haven't seen you guys for almost a year. I think it's worth getting up early for, all right?" She reached over and patted his hand. "Thank you," she said. "It is good to see you again, and Danny's on cloud 9. She took a sip of wine. He looked at her for a moment. "What?" Teresa said at last. "I found out that Cyberdyne has started up again." "Well, I knew that," she said. "They started up again about a month after the plant was destroyed. I can't see why they wouldn't." "I meant that they started Miles's project," Jordan said, looking grim. Teresa felt her muscles knot up. They destroyed everything. There was no way that Cyberdyne could start up Miles's project again, especially after 6 years. She shifted in her chair, bringing her legs up and folding them to the side. "Why shouldn't they, Jordan? Cyberdyne is a business. They probably started again as soon as the insurance company gave them a check." Giving him a searching look, she asked, "Did you expect them to just close their books and forget about it?" They started up again in a secret installation on an army base, her brother-in-law said. He was insistent, as though he was making a point that she just wasn't getting. Unfortunately, she was getting the message all too clearly. More clearly than Jordan. She wished she knew how to contact the Connors. This was something they'd want to know. If they were even alive. A surge of anger surprised her. Miles died to stop that damn thing. They have no right. Can't be too secret if you know about it, she said aloud. He made an impatient, dismissive gesture. I'm an investigator. Finding things out is what I do. But the important thing is they might be using Miles's work, which means they might owe you and the kids some kind of royalty or something. Shaking her head, she told him, No, of that I'm sure. Miles was developing something they had already started. It wasn't his original work, so they could hardly owe him anything for it. Didn't he ever talk about it? Jordan leaned towards her, his eyes growing intense. Just that it was fascinating and he loved what he was doing, and that it wasn't like anything he'd ever worked on before. You know all this, Jordan. I've told you this before. She turned away. But didn't he ever mention details? As much as you do, she said, giving him a significant look. You boys always knew how to play your cards close to your chests. For all I knew, you were running a bordello out of that basement apartment of yours. I was not running a bordello, Jordan said with a little half smile. Well, there were squeals of girlish laughter that might have given argument to that, Teresa said with a grin. Or a numbers racket, he added. He held his hand up, stopping her laughing response. Please, don't change the subject, Jordan said, his eyes deadly serious. He put his wine aside and leaned his forearms on his thighs, totally focused. Wearily, Teresa leaned her head against the back of the chair and closed her eyes. Did he ever mention being followed? Stop right there, she said, holding up a finger. Teresa matched his posture and lowered her voice. I'll tell you right now, Jordan, when I opened my front door and saw you on my porch tonight, my heart sank. Because I knew that at the first opportunity you would do this. I just want to find out what happened, he said reasonably. You might remember something if I ask the right question. Do you think that I haven't gone over this and over this in my mind? She glared at him. Do you think that I will ever forget one moment of that night? Maybe you don't think that I've asked myself that if I'd done something different, would Miles still be alive? Well, I have. She nodded fiercely. I've thought, I've questioned, I've wondered. And every time you come here and we have one of these sessions, I lie awake for weeks afterward, wondering about it all over again. I wonder if what you're really asking is why didn't you do something to save my brother? Why are you still alive while he's dead? That's not true, Jordan said, straight in shock. I never thought that. I've never stopped grieving for him, Jordan, and I never will. But I tell you right now, I can't keep doing this. It feels like punishment, and I won't stand for it anymore. Do you understand? After a moment of staring at her open-mouthed, he said, No, I don't understand. I just want to find the people who killed my brother. I owe him that, Teresa. I owe him. His eyes pleaded for understanding. If you found those people tomorrow and put them on trial, I really can't say that I'd even go to watch, she said. I'm tired, Jordan, tired and heartsore. But it's time to move on. I can't take this anymore. He looked at her in disbelief. Don't you want to know who killed him? He said. I know who killed him, she said. She looked away from him for a moment and composed herself, stifled the tears that filled her eyes. The SWAT team killed Miles. What? Jordan found himself on his feet and slowly sat back down. Who the hell told you that? The team commander, she said, looking him in the eye. He had cancer and he had Miles's death on his conscience. She began to fiddle with the arm of her chair. Then she looked up at him. They saw him. They shot him. They didn't cry out a warning. No drop your weapons, hands up, none of that. They basically came in shooting. He never had a chance. Jordan looked sick as well as shocked. I didn't want to tell you, she said, closing her eyes. I knew it would hit you hard, but it wasn't the terrorist that killed him. It was the police. Oh my God, Jordan whispered. They covered it up. He flopped back in his chair, then took his wine and tossed the rest of it down. For a while he sat staring into space, his hands caressing the glass. Then he put it on the table and buried his face in his hands, elbows on his knees. No, he said, shaking his head. He wouldn't have been there except for the terrorists. They have to be punished. I'm going to bed, Teresa said angrily. She pushed herself up from her chair and moved rapidly towards the stairs, then stopped and turned around. I'm never going to talk to you about this again, Jordan. Never. If you can't keep from asking, then I guess we won't be seeing each other anymore. And I don't want you torturing Danny with questions either. He was just a baby when it happened, and he can't tell you anything now. She came back towards him in a few steps, once again lowering her voice. And every time you stir this up, it gives him terrible dreams. When he was younger, he woke up screaming. So I'm telling you once and for all, I want you to stop this. She brought her fist down to pound her thigh. I want you to stop torturing us. It wasn't our fault. We couldn't do anything but what we did, and all the questions in the world won't bring Miles back. Teresa turned away and mounted the first few steps. And then she let out her breath. I love you, Jordan, she said. I love you like you were my own brother. I really, really hope that you can see my side of this because I want you in my life. She gave him one last tear-filled look and then walked up the stairs. Jordan sat there for a few moments. He heard the door to her room close, then slowly let out his breath as he leaned back and put his hand over his eyes. He felt incredibly tired and sad. I can't let it go, he whispered, his teeth clenched. I can't. He sighed. But he could leave Teresa and Dan out of it. He hadn't thought about how it might feel to them when he asked his questions. Okay, he said aloud. From now on, I'll keep it to myself, Teresa. The next time she heard about this would be after those bastards had been tried and convicted, because he would never give up. Cyberdyne Systems Corporation, Fort Laurel, California. The present. This place sucks, Roger Colvin said. The CEO put his briefcase down on the highly polished but rather small conference room table and looked around. Institutional, bland, too functional, without the little touches of class he'd come to expect. Cheap, he thought. Is this room bugged? Paul Warren, Cyberdyne's president, shrugged, looking gloomy. It would seem superfluous, he said. We give them daily reports. They know who and what goes in and out. All of our calls are handled by their switching station. Just with that, they know as much as we do about what's going on in the company. Probably more. Having us underground seems a bit much, Colvin said. He twitched the knees of his trousers and sat. I swear it's affecting my allergies. That smell, Warren said. Yeah, what is that? The president shrugged. I think it might be the carpet adhesive. That stuff always stinks for weeks after it's laid down. What I mind is the lack of space. He looked up at the ceiling. I'm not crazy about being buried alive either. Colvin gave him a quick look from under his eyebrows. That was a disturbing thought, especially in California. So why did you call me? He said. Warren looked up at him in surprise. Call you? I didn't call you. My secretary said that I had a meeting with you here at 2:30. They looked at each other in mutual perplexity. Then, simultaneously, light dawned. Trick, Colvin began. Gentlemen! Tricker breezed through the door and set his case down on the table. I hope I haven't kept you waiting. I know how busy you are assigning the parking spaces and all. After a beat, Colvin said, his expression disapproving, Actually, we've been getting this project up and running, and after 6 years, that's not as simple as it would have been. I've always wondered why, exactly, you refuse to let us start up again right away. Well, Tricker sat down and opened his case, placing a file before him. I have some questions, if you don't mind. He looked at them both, smiling pleasantly. And if we did? Warren muttered. Tricker opened the file, took a pen from his pocket, and made a note. Are you going to answer my questions? Colvin finally asked him. That was a question, Mr. Colvin? It didn't sound like a question. Tricker shook his head. I don't have your answer, I'm afraid. I'm just the messenger boy. I bet you tried to run the project yourselves, didn't you? The CEO asked. I wouldn't know that. Tricker pushed his case aside and looked up with guileless eyes. You did, didn't you? Colvin smacked his hand down on the table. Son of a bitch, I knew it. He grinned and shook his head. You tried it and you couldn't do it, could you? You found out that you needed us. Tricker smiled amiably and shrugged. So, Tricker asked, clasping his hands over the open file. You've been here for a couple of weeks. How's it working out, gentlemen? He looked at them both with great interest. The president and CEO exchanged a look of exasperation. Obviously, their liaison wasn't in a communicative mood. I feel like I'm being watched all the time, Warren said resentfully, Like every time I take a dump, someone somewhere is measuring it. This facility has that capability, Mr. Warren. But unless we see what appears to be drug abuse, I don't think we'll be using it. Colvin and Warren goggled at him. Anything else? Tricker said more seriously. Are you kidding? Colvin asked. No. Tricker sat back and looked at them, waiting for an answer to his question. The two executives looked at each other, then turned back to their adversary. The air quality is a concern, Colvin said after a moment. There have been complaints about it affecting allergies, and people are commenting on the smell. Tricker looked at him for a moment, his chin cupped in his hand. Really? He said at last. Yes, Warren answered with exaggerated patience. Really. That's interesting. The liaison sat forward. Because this facility is fitted with more efficient air scrubbers than your old facility had. His eyebrows went up. I did notice a trace of ozone in the air, though. I'll have it checked for you. If that's the case, then why are people having allergy problems? Warren asked. Maybe it's because going from near 0 parts per million of pollutants to the great outdoors is a hell of a wallop for the human system to take. Tricker looked at them and shrugged. Anything else? Do we have to be underground? Colvin asked. I find it disturbing to be in a buried facility. Well, it's a lot safer, don't you think? Tricker's blue eyes moved from one to the other. Look, he said, sitting forward and spreading his hands. I know you think of that corner office with the windows as being one of the perks of your position. But after what happened, I think you wouldn't want to be working in a fishbowl. Haven't you boys ever heard of high-powered rifles? Warren and Colvin exchanged a glance from the corners of their eyes. I just don't like being here, Warren said. I don't like being watched all the time. What makes you think you're being watched? Tricker asked, looking fascinated. You just told us you could measure... Warren waved his hands helplessly. Hey, I told you we could, but we weren't. Tricker leaned back. I really must say that I didn't expect this attitude from the man who instituted urine testing for all employees and job applicants. Warren glared at him, while Colvin examined the ceiling. Look, boys, could we drop this child of the 70s thing you've got going here, along with the knee-jerk, anti-government response to the idea of our involvement? Has it occurred to you that you're letting your prejudices run away with you? He looked a bit hurt. We are not spying on you. Hell, you're inundating us with jargon-filled reports on this and that. Who has time to spy on you? Leaning forward, he folded his hands in front of him and looked at the two men steadily. If you'll recall, Mr. Colvin, Mr. Warren. The pale eyes flicked from one to the other. You came to us. You found this amazing stuff stuck in your factory and you needed a huge shot of money to develop it. You didn't want to risk offering it to one of your larger competitors in a partnership deal because you'd seen too many smaller companies get devoured that way, and you thought that if we heard about it, we just might confiscate it for the sake of national security. Besides, you figured that you'd need a customer with real deep pockets eventually. Tricker spread his hands and widened his eyes. So, who else were you going to turn to? The two businessmen looked away. Knowing how fickle businesses can be, we naturally insisted that you sell these items, now missing, Tricker said with deadly emphasis, to us outright. But we contracted to allow you to be the exclusive developer of this find. He looked at them as though waiting for some response. He got none. After a moment, he continued. Now, suddenly you think you've sold your soul to the devil. Well, poor you. Tricker got up and began to pace. Warren and Colvin glanced at one another and then stared at their liaison morosely. Tricker turned and stared back at them. So, what evil things have we done to you? What we've done, gentlemen, is to provide you with a secure, safe, state-of-the-art facility at the taxpayer's expense. And despite the fact that our material has been stolen or destroyed because of your lousy bungling security, we haven't demanded 1 red cent of compensation. Which shows how incredibly greedy and evil we are. He stopped and glared at the executives. You jerks came knocking on our door. You volunteered, fellas. Now we're just trying to protect our considerable investment. You could have said no, you know? And how could we have done that? Colvin inquired with quiet sarcasm. Tricker spread his hands. How could you have avoided all of this, you ask? By giving us the material you sold to us and any work you've done on it. In other words, you could have said no simply by saying no. You still could. He glanced back and forth between them. So, are you finished having your little tantrum, or do you want to waste more time here? Colvin grimly examined the table before him, a muscle jumping in his cheek. Then he looked up at Tricker. Why did you want to see us? Finally. Well, gentlemen. Tricker sat down again and tidied some papers in his file. How's the search coming? He looked at them like an eager student waiting for approval. The two men looked puzzled. For the security manager? Colvin and Warren just stared at him. We're on a military base buried underground, Warren said at last. Why do we need a security manager? Why? Tricker raised his brows. Because you do, that's why. This is your company and you've already lost a major part of your material. We expect you're desperate to preserve the rest of it. So, shall I find someone for you? His expression had become hard. I don't want to impose, but I'm going to have to insist that you take care of this immediately. What exactly is the big rush? Warren asked impatiently. Tricker referred to his file. Well, he said, looking up. This guy you're hiring, Kurt Weimeister. That's a good hire, Colvin said aggressively, pointing to the file. We've been negotiating that for a while now. The guy's an Austrian national, Tricker said evenly. And this is a top secret project. He was 12 years old when his family emigrated to the US, for Christ's sake, Colvin said. Besides, he's a naturalized citizen. Austria's just a memory for this guy. Tricker's exasperation was plain. Yeah. Have you looked into his background at all? He's a genuine prodigy. He finished high school at 14, got a full scholarship to USC and his master's and doctorate at MIT before he was 22. Colvin continued. He's the foremost authority in the world on real model computer language. So he'll teach the system we have to answer to spoken commands and to answer verbally, Warren explained. Not just menus, understanding what it's hearing and saying. Chinese box stuff. Tricker sneered. Oh, so you've got a kraut that talks to a box. How nice. He's not a kraut, he's Austrian. So he's a kraut in 3/4 time who talks to a box. No go. Since you already know about him, I'm surprised you didn't realize how amazingly qualified he is, Warren said. Did you know he's a Nazi? Tricker asked. Excuse me, a member of the Integral National Socialist Renewal Movement, Tyrolese branch. Colvin and Warren exchanged a glance. He is? Warren said. National Socialist. He sure as hell negotiated like one, Colvin muttered. A lot of geniuses, when they have political ideas at all, have these. Warren chuckled and waved his hands around. These airy-fairy notions about how things ought to be. Usually it goes no further than an occasional late-night bull session. Airy-fairy, Tricker said, genuinely appalled. I have never before heard Nazism referred to as a airy-fairy notion, Mr. Warren. I'll bet your boy Kurt wouldn't thank you for that description either. He gave the president a long look. In any event, he pulled a piece of paper out of his file. Your Wunderkind has been in a number of marches for which he's been arrested twice. 3 of his closest friends have been arrested for conspiring to blow up a post office, and he rarely misses meetings. Maybe that's because he's secretary for his local chapter. He tossed the paper across the table. This is not the kind of guy we like to see hired to work on our defense projects. Colvin flicked the paper towards himself with his fingertips. He read it and pursed his lips. We're going to have to pay a huge kill fee, he said. Which should tell you that he knew this was going to happen and that he was just jerking you around, Tricker said. If you had a half-decent security chief, this wouldn't have happened. Warren shook his head. This guy is the best, he said. We absolutely need him. Tricker widened his eyes and leaned forward. Well, you can't have him, he said softly. Paul's right, Colvin cut in, looking grim. We need him. Without Vimaster, we might be stuck for years. Years? Tricker asked, obviously disbelieving. Colvin nodded. He's basically the inventor of a new science, Warren explained. He hasn't trained anybody, so there's no competition, but there is a lot of competition for his services. Weimeister has only let out hints of what he's accomplished, but if even half of what he's telling us is true, it will revolutionize computer communication. We're talking AI here, Mr. Tricker. The government liaison looked at him dubiously. Just Tricker, he said at last. Rubbing his chin thoughtfully, he looked at the two. I need to interview him. Raising his hand, he forestalled an automatic protest from Warren. I promise not to bring my rubber hose, okay? But you can hardly expect us to just automatically approve this, especially in light of the previous disaster. And you must have a good security chief. Soon. Tricker pinned them with a blue glare. Set up a meeting for me with your kraut, pardon me, with your cream pastry chef fucking Mozart Austrian crypto-fascist. He tossed them a white card, blank, but for an email address. Drop me a line when you've got it arranged. He put the file together, dropped it into his case, and slammed the lid. Giving them a last, ambiguous look, he left. I do not like that guy, Warren muttered, seething. Colvin glanced at Cyberdyne's president. I really don't think he gives a damn. Colorado, 2028. It was a beautiful day, the air soft and warm, birds twittering melodiously. A gentle breeze wafted pine-scented air to Serena's nostrils. The sky was an azure bowl over the earth, and they were far from the cindered blast zones. Far off, a single hunter-killer flew patrol, a black dot against the clear sky. Lieutenant Zeller lowered her binoculars and consulted her map. Almost there, she said. Serena looked at her. The lieutenant's dark, lovely face was tired and serious. The humans were about to launch an attack on one of Skynet's power cell factories, which meant coordinating with several other free-roaming teams. They would be the last in position because of the distance they'd had to cover. Communication was the key to a successful mission. Communication was going to be interrupted. Serena was pleased with herself, and Skynet was also. Her mission so far had been a resounding success. She'd been with the team for 6 weeks now, and had, with the help of their intelligence, foiled 7 separate missions. Not all of them were her teams, of course. That would have raised suspicions. But with every little effort, she'd managed to ferret out a great deal of sensitive information. It genuinely never occurred to these people that she might be working for Skynet. In a way, it amused Serena that with all the enhancements, mechanical and genetic, that had been lavished on her, it was the simple ability to look human that was her most valuable asset. That ability had also helped her to kill, directly or indirectly, 4 of the original team members. Corporal Ortez's death had shattered poor Corman Gonzalez, and if Lieutenant Zeller was the unit's head, then Gonzalez was its broken heart, leaving the whole group's morale very low. And with 4 untried new team members, they were also very anxious. Today, it was the lieutenant's turn to die. The woman was simply too effective and too much of a leader to be allowed to live. She'd also been giving Serena some rather long and thoughtful looks lately, doubtless because of the I-950's endless questions. "Let's move out," the lieutenant said. They'd been taking a brief rest after a long march through the woods. So far, no one had commented on how very sparsely protected this factory was. Serena found this strange. She'd been monitoring all the humans' units as they came up to their positions, and absolutely no one had mentioned it. True, it was supposed to be a hidden facility, but it was also supposed to be vital, and the place should have been swarming with HKs and T-90s. So why doesn't anyone notice? She wondered. It bothered her. Perhaps I should say something. She fervently wished she could ask Skynet, but they couldn't risk any anomalous signals being detected from her vicinity. Curiosity itched like a healing wound. The unit moved quickly, but carefully, spaced out, avoiding each other's line of fire, but keeping each other in sight, eyes moving at all times. Serena found herself wishing that something would happen. The stupid, twittering birds were getting on her nerves. The I-950 raised her plasma rifle, reminding herself to be extremely careful. Lieutenant Zeller had a better nose for danger and even better reflexes than the average human. So far, the ambush had gone beautifully. The remainder of the unit was pinned down in a little declivity, the earth-filled remains of a basement surrounded by T-90s. Plasma bolts split the night, a night lit ruddily by the burning trees around the ruins of the old house. Smoke was heavy and acrid on the air, mixed with the smells of scorched metal and ionized air. "Shit!" Zeller screamed as her weapon misfired and ducked. That put her eyes directly on the tall blonde woman behind her. Serena raised her weapon and snapped off a single accurate shot to the alloy steel skull of the T-90 looming over the crumbled concrete lip of the unit's last stand position. The metal skeleton snapped backward, fire gouting as its CPU was destroyed in a wash of ionized copper molecules. The beam was a bar of violet light through the darkness. "Thanks," Zeller gasped. "De nada," Serena said sullenly. She hated destroying T-90s. They were cute. "Here they come!" someone shouted. Serena tensed herself. Time to liquidate them all. The world ended. She screamed and clapped her hands to her skull, fell to the ground, and curled herself into a fetal ball. Light burning! Light burning! Everyone else was screaming as well, some pouring at blinded eyes where night sight goggles hadn't quite compensated for the sudden actinic flash. Everyone knew what it was, from their parents' stories, if not from their own experience. The flash of a nuclear weapon is extremely distinctive. Seconds later, the blast wave hit. Ground bounced and hammered at them as it rippled, and a wind like a demon's breath tore the fringe of vegetation from around the pit where they crouched. A few seconds later, as Serena's self-repairing computer components rerouted around damaged circuitry, she realized that the pit had protected her from most of the electromagnetic pulse of the weapon, and her companions from the direct radiation. She was supposed to be shielded from EMP, but apparently some new wrinkles had been developed. The T-90s and hunter-killers beyond were all non-functional, twitching or still even where the overpressure of flying debris hadn't wrecked them. Fallout was another matter, of course. Lieutenant Zeller was the first on her feet, moving around, checking on her squad. Everyone was alive, and only one was immobile. Gonzalez with a broken leg. "What was that?" Serena asked, the shakiness in her voice partly genuine. "I was nearly fried from the inside out," she thought, controlling a stab of cold fear. With the electronic portions of herself dead, she would have been a drooling idiot at best, and the mission would have been totally compromised. The enemy would have a complete I-950 to study. "That was John Connor," Zeller said. Everyone's attention snapped to her, even in the flame-shot darkness. "I just got the word," Zeller said proudly. "Connor knew it was a trap, but a trap with real bait. We were supposed to walk into an overwhelming force. The enemy knew we were coming. But they didn't know Connor was coming. with the Central Strike Squad and a nuke they dug out of a silo and jiggered around. Skynet's down half of its mobile unit power cell capacity, people. That's what we bought while we were distracting it. Serena cheered with the others. This is intolerable, she thought. Connor must be removed. Cyberdyne Systems, the present. Kurt Weimeister was a big man, 29 years of age, easily 6 feet tall, and a mountain of muscle. He wore his ash blonde hair in an aggressive brush cut, and his blue eyes were long and narrow and cold. His jaw was so strong it looked like he could eat the business end of a shovel. He was the physical antithesis of a computer geek. His attitude was superior and all business. "Here is how it's going to be," Weimeister began. His accent was ostentatiously thick for someone who had been in the United States since he was 12. "I will have unlimited access to this facility, day or night." "Here's the way it is," Tricker countered. "When you come in, you can stay as long as you want. Once you've left, you can't come back without clearing it with whoever we appoint. When you leave completely empty-handed. You do not take data home. You don't call the facility direct, either voice or link. In fact, the facility will have a complete physical firewall. You don't speak to or socialize with people involved in any division except those directly involved with your own part of your own project." Weimeister waited a beat, as if to see if the government liaison had anything to add. "That is unacceptable," he said at last, his lip curling in contempt. "Well, then I guess we're done, because that's not negotiable." Tricker made to rise from his chair. "No one else can offer you what I can," the Austrian said scornfully. "No one else can offer you what we've got," Warren said earnestly. Weimeister glanced at him, his expression conveying disbelief and amusement. "Good thing you don't want him for his charm," Tricker said, leaning back with a smile. It was obvious he wanted to watch the two businessmen take a pounding from this scientific prima donna. "I have had offers for huge sums of money from over a dozen mature companies, and they don't want to put ridiculous restrictions on my movements, or on what I can say or who I can speak to." He waved a careless hand. "The money you are offering is okay, but this certainly isn't the spirit of cooperation in which you first approached me," Weimeister said, shooting an accusatory look at Colvin. "Since we started negotiations, the government has taken a closer interest in our work, probably because terrorists destroyed our first facility," Colvin said mildly. "Yeah, and now you're working on this army reservation," Weimeister said. "I'm not sure I want to work for the US government. You never mentioned anything about that," he complained. "You'd still be working for Cyberdyne," Colvin said smoothly. "Yeah, and Cyberdyne is working for the US government, so I'd be working for the US government. This is all semantics, and I know a hell of a lot more about that than you do. So stop trying to play games," Weimeister jeered. Colvin and Warren both looked at Tricker, who shook his head. When their looks turned pleading, Tricker raised his brows and shook his head again. "Don't make puppy eyes at me," he said. "I don't want him at all. I think he's too big a risk. But I am starting to wonder just what kind of a deal you can cut with him. If you dump him, you pay a huge kill fee. If he leaves, what happens? You still pay him a huge kill fee. Colvin and Warren looked at the table. You're kidding, right? Tricker waited. You know, you guys shouldn't be let out alone. You do know that. My time is valuable. Weimeister looked smug. Tricker shook his head in disgust. Well, make up your mind, he said. 'Cause you're not finding out anything about this project unless you're locked in. My terms are not negotiable. Over to you, Kurt. Weimeister glared at him. Oh, and Kurt? Tricker grinned and nodded. This is it. Yes or no, right now. It's today or it's never. You don't even know what you're throwing away. Neither do you, little buddy, Tricker said, still grinning. I make more in 1 year than you probably make in 5. Weimeister sneered. Is that a no? If I work for Cyberdyne, I'll be making almost twice as much. Is that a yes? Tricker was enjoying himself hugely. The big man waved a ham-like hand at him. Why am I effing talking to you? You are just an ignorant cop. Tricker beamed at him, blue eyes twinkling. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars. We are talking about pure science. What do you know about these things? Shaking his head and spreading his hands, Tricker smiled ruefully. I don't know nothing about making hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I don't know a damn thing about pure science. He dropped his hands. What I do know is, he pointed to the door, you walk out of here without a commitment to work exclusively for Cyberdyne under our terms, you don't get to come back. Ever. There will be no renegotiation, no second approaches, nothing ever. He tilted his head, grinning. Did you know that? I don't have to put up with this. Weimeister glanced at Colvin. Unfortunately, you do, if you want to work for us, the CEO told him. He shrugged. We're over a barrel here ourselves. The government is willing to leave us alone for the most part, and the restrictions they've placed on us are for our own safety and for the safety of the company. Colvin drew himself up. The choice is yours. The big scientist glared around the table, not liking the situation one bit. He was used to people giving in to him. He was used to them thinking he was worth suffering humiliation and bullying. His physical presence didn't hurt usually either. But Tricker was utterly immune to reputation, and to muscle as well. Usually people with Superman fantasies weigh 300 pounds, have no neck, and pimples like purple quarters. Colvin thought resentfully. And that's just the women. Why do I have to run into one who is really a fucking Superman? Why do I have to be caught between him and this spook bureaucrat? The budget you promised, the facilities, the eventual publication of my work. That all stands, Warren said. When he says eventual publication of his work, you did make it clear that anything we feel should be classified will be. Tricker nailed Colvin with his glare. Yes, of course. That worthy said in exasperation. That's to our benefit too. Whatever Mr. Weimeister publishes will concern his own work on commercial projects until after the copyright has expired. Or with special permission, you said. Yes, Colvin agreed, sounding harried. Then I will sign your contract. Weimeister's expression was grim, as though he were signing away his life instead of signing a contract most scientists could only dream of. Cheer up, Kurt, Tricker said. You are about to enter a whole new world. On that, the government liaison rose and without another word left the conference room. He could feel the young scientist trying to burn a hole in his jacket with a high wattage glare. Tricker knew the type. This guy was the kind that would consider any compromise a humiliation, requiring a vengeful response. Some of these boys were willing to go pretty far to get their own back. The Kraut would have to be watched, and he'd also have to keep harrying Tweedledum and Tweedledummer about a security chief. San Gabriel Peak, Angeles National Forest, California, 2029. Captain Marie Graber looked over her shoulder, back down the narrow mountain trail. 3 or 4 soldiers behind trod the golden-haired woman who ignited the joy in her soul. Marie grinned. Sergeant Serena Burns looked up and caught her glance, returning the smile with interest. The captain's heart lifted as she turned forward again and continued to climb. It was hard to remember the icy bleakness that had hollowed her out for so long now that she had Serena. Her lover had renewed her hope almost from the first moment they'd met. The thin highland air smelled sweet, even sweeter than the smell of resin from the pines all around. Marie and her team had been holed up in Boulder, Colorado, running low on almost everything but sweet potatoes, of which they hadn't had that many. God, how she hated sweet potatoes. Serena had arrived with dispatches and a chunk of maple sugar. It was love at first sight. The sergeant had been with her for 6 weeks now, as they'd wended their way back to base. Now the captain was going to have the honor and the pleasure of presenting her beloved to the Supreme Commander. General John Connor, the man who was going to save the human race. She was near bursting with pride. Serena watched the captain climb with satisfaction. She'd been with Connor's army for less than 6 months, most of that time delivering dispatches, most of them reading the same way they did when given to her. The closest she'd got to Connor had been the day she was nearly killed by him when he outsmarted Skynet at the power cell factory. Some of the dispatches had been artfully altered so that the results favoured Skynet forces. Some were delivered just too late, but with sufficiently desperate effort that no questions were asked, no blame ascribed. She grinned. Even though she wasn't human, she just had to admit that there was pleasure in a job well done. Every step upward brought her closer to the ultimate goal of the destruction of John Connor, and, if she was fortunate, his senior support staff. Many of them were supposed to be with him on this occasion. True, killing Connor might not save Skynet, whose defense grid was smashed, but it could slow things down enough to make a difference. One thing Serena had learned in her time with humans was that refusing to admit defeat often averted it. If you gave up, you were certain to lose. If you kept fighting in a hopeless corner, you might just pull it off. Killing Connor would certainly extinguish her, but you couldn't have everything. Something the captain was fond of saying. Skynet would go on. That was the important thing, and Skynet was the most important part of her. As she neared the top of the steps, Serena twitched a muscle deep inside and started the countdown on the bomb she carried with her. A sidebar in her vision began a countdown. Her head came up above the steps, and through the crowd she could almost see him at last. John Connor. A soldier's head blocked her view of everything but the top of his head, one eye and a shoulder. He seemed to be smiling as he shook the hand of the man before him. Even from behind, Serena could tell that the soldier would have stars in his eyes. The count was 15 seconds. 14. 13. Return to base. Skynet's command was adamant. Automatically, Serena stopped the countdown. She stepped back, covered her mouth as though she was going to be sick, and widened her eyes to a semblance of desperation. Soldiers stepped aside sympathetically. "I'll explain to the captain," one of them whispered. She waved her hand in appreciation and fled.